Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to our new series on the prophets, the early prophets, and mainly we'll concentrate on Isaiah and the different Isaiahs that are there. But mainly, from my perspective, it will be the message of Isaiah, but how it also translates to other prophets, either in his times or in other times. So this is really what the series is about, is moving to the next step in terms of our text. For a few years I taught it at a Catholic shrine, and I learned a lot from the Catholics. Then we brought it here, and I wanted to learn about the New Testament. And that's how I started teaching with Don. And now after 3 years of teaching the New Testament, we go back to agreeing on a text. So there's the prophets, we agree on the text. There's no, one of the things about my trip, the recent trip, which I'll talk about a little bit, was that, yes, we do Jewish Christian. We don't have the Muslim component or other religions. It began as Project Genesis because Jews and Christians at least agree on the text, on Genesis. I can't do it with Muslims. I can learn text that would be equal in both sides, and we can talk about the value in the text. But we can't agree on a text. So this is a big deal, that both religions agree on a text. So it's the first miracle is that all Jews agree on a text. For 3,500 years about, if you can imagine that, we agree about basically nothing else. But the text is the text. So now we come back to a familiar and familial even territory. This is how we are cousins with Jews and Christians, because we agree on those on texts and of course the values that come out of these texts. So in the prophets, all these values that we've been talking about for the past at least 10 years and all your life basically, they will bring all the values that we learned in both the Hebrew, the scripture, and the New Testament. They are now going to surface things that we all will agree on. So, for example, we all agree on social justice. There's when we talk about the Judeo-Christian values, when people throw this term in the air, that's really usually what it means, right? Because we don't agree on everything, but we definitely agree on helping the poor. I would say that's the first sacrifice, and this is one of the big messages of the prophets in general, is don't bring me your sacrifices. I don't need, God is telling the people, I don't need your sacrifices if they don't come with sincerity. It's like you just killed an animal. You shed blood for nothing, and we value blood. That is where life is, right? Even the Torah tells us that's where the soul is. It's in the blood. So spilling blood is really just for this redemptive quality. Otherwise, you're just spilling blood. And the prophets keep hammering this message. Don't think you can outsmart God. You're going to be dressed the part. You're going to have the most expensive bull. You're going to have all your family there. But you know what? If you do not intend to change or to transform as part of this experience, you're wasting your time. God is saying, even though I'm beyond time, you're wasting my time. Right? If there's such a thing. So this is the big message of the prophet that we will learn. Now, I am not an expert in prophets, I have to say. It's not going to happen overnight. Don here, as you remember, I was the student in this lecture series, and commented on Don's teaching. So we basically will continue that format. Don will lead this. He will, because he's more familiar with the prophets. Unfortunately, I'm saying it. A lot of Jews don't study the prophets. We value the Talmud very much, and the Talmud is considered the ocean it's the ocean of the Talmud, and all the rivers flow into the sea. Right? So it means that in that Talmud, when you study Talmud, you basically get all the ingredients. You get the prophets, you get the Torah, you get the Mishnah, you get everything that you need. Law, stories, midrashim, you get everything. So people who think of times that there was no time to study, we live in a society that there's leisure time. But imagine times when people had to, in shtetls in Poland or, on the mountains of Yemen, there was no time to study that much. So you had to concentrate. So the rabbis decided that studying Talmud is better option, because then you get everything. You get one meal a day, so to speak, put all the ingredients in it. So we're in that realm a lot more than in the prophets. That's not to say that they're knowledgeable rabbis about this, and Jews in general, of course. But for the most part, we don't pay attention to the prophets as much as we do to the Talmud. So, okay. It's a big introduction. So Don will lead the text, and I will bring it to values that come out from the Torah, as I've been doing. Okay. Can I talk about 5 minutes about my trip? Would you like me to talk about the trip? Okay. Danger. Okay, so I came back a week ago, basically, on Friday, from a month away. So first of all, it's amazing to be able to take a month away, because you can really do work and transformation. So I was in Israel for that month, and I traveled with two groups. The first group was a Catholic pilgrimage. It was basically a Catholic pilgrimage with a rabbi. We're trying all kinds of models, and every year I've been traveling in different formats. Last year we did the Jewish Christian Project Genesis trip, but the problem was that we didn't have Jews on the trip. It ended up being all Christians and actually all Catholics. So that's why we figured this year we're not going to work that hard. We're going to let the company who does that to do it, and I just joined a Catholic pilgrimage. I was actually, after the trip, I was invited to speak at the Pax Romana at the UN to talk about the interfaith work that we do. So last week I also presented there the whole interfaith work and how it transformed me and people around me. And I literally just came back from that trip. So the first one was 10 days with the Catholic pilgrimage, which was incredible to me. I've never been on a strictly Catholic pilgrimage. That is an eye-opener as a religious man, to see this sincerity. I told him at the end of the trip, I learned so much from you as I was commenting, but the best thing about teaching is the learning part. So I told them that one thing that I learned from you, I learned it from the shrine, but it really is on the trip, on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, most of them for the first time. So imagine the sincerity of the group. And Patty, who normally is here, she came last year with her daughter, and this year she came with her son. So that's incredible. So maybe next year she'll come with her other son. We're working on it. She's coming? So she may be at the end. We'll be able to say a few more words about it. But anyway, I told them what I've learned the most from you is your lack of, it's a good thing, but lack of cynicism. It was just a religious experience. Forget which religion, but it was a religious experience to see people come to, for me, Israel is where I grew up. This is where I went to the beach. I didn't value these things as much. I knew that it was a special place, but still, the Sea of Galilee is where we used to spend our summers. It wasn't a holy place. It was a holy place in its own way, but it was not until I met the Christian groups and realized how much holiness they see in the Sea of Galilee. It's amazing. And then through that, I actually discovered the Jewish holy places in the Galilee. That was interesting in its own. Anyway, so we learn a lot from each other. But the lack of cynicism, we're in Purim now. Today is Purim, is the holiday of Purim. The story of Purim, they wanted to destroy us in ancient Persia, and look, we're still kind of in the same story. But they tried to annihilate the Jewish people, and the queen, who happened to be Jewish at that point, talked to her husband, and he realized what the plot against the Jews, and somehow not reversed it, but let the Jews gave the Jews permission to fight back. And the Jews actually won against their enemies, and we celebrate that. So it means that it flipped. It flipped. We thought it went one way, no hope, and all of a sudden there was hope. Cynicism is this Shabbat. We talked about the need to destroy the nation of Amalek. Whichever is the nation of Amalek, we don't know, but we are commanded to destroy it. And Amalek, Haman, from the story of Purim, is a descendant of Amalek. But beyond that, Amalek is the force who tries to drag us down all the time. It's that cynical voice in our own heads, in other people's heads. That is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And that's what we're supposed to kind of cut off. And you only do it with full sincerity. It doesn't have to mean that you're a saint or you're always sincere, but that you have these moments that you're able to be fully there with God. And I saw that in this group. And that was for me, this is something that it's the most important thing to learn as a religious person, is how to be with your own faith, be with God, for having these moments that it doesn't matter. The Middle East is shaking, and Israel is very stable, of course, but you're traveling to a region that is not viewed as safe, and you're doing this. You're ignoring all the noises, and you're able to be focusing with your beliefs, with your God. That to me is inspirational as a religious person. Okay, so that was the one trip with the Catholics, and then I participated after the pilgrimage. I participated in a praying together initiative that the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, there were other Abrahamic religions like the Druze, the Bedouins, the Baha'i, they were all there, the Sufis, there were a lot of Sufis there, praying together. I never had that experience of praying with multiple religions, and definitely not with Muslims. I've attended, one time, and we had a study that we studied holy places, and we went to a mosque, and we saw the prayer, but it wasn't really any interaction with Muslims. I really didn't have so much. So that was a special thing. And then from that event, I met this group of called Abrahamic Reunion with all the Abrahamic religions, with Orthodox Jews, with Muslim imams, Bedouin sheikhs, Christian clergy. Everybody is there. And they travel around the country to really talk to people and voice the religious voice, the clergy voice that seemed to be too suppressed somehow. We don't hear enough, and when we hear it, a lot of times it's anti-rhetoric, and that's in the Middle East. It's not a good thing. The Muslims, I have to say, there's a family that participated in those and got threats, and had to actually leave Israel and move to the United States. So, but they came on that pilgrimage. So essentially I did another pilgrimage with the more Muslim-oriented group. So I got the full picture of both, even in the holy places, the holy sites. We went to both sides, which I've never been. So I could have only gone with that group. And I've seen, for example, the Muslim side of the Ma'arat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, where it was believed that our forefathers are buried and foremothers. So that's a great way to maybe have some sort of way to agree that maybe just access to the holy sites can be granted. Let's push the noises that are there from the political side. I'm not a politician. I'll leave the politician to do their job, and I'm going to do my job, which is to push for free access to holy sites in Israel and Palestine. Let's start with that. If we can pray together, and if the clergy come together and really get along first with each other, then I think we can start something. So this is the effort that I'm now leading with the Abrahamic Reunion, and that's why also it was helpful to speak at the Pax Romana, where they're mostly retired diplomats, but still have connection to people that we need to do that. And that would be one of the efforts that Project Genesis, in its interfaith effort, will try to push for. And you can be part of it if you'd like, but we'll talk more about that. So this basically was my trip, and it was clearly ordained by God, because there's no way that I would have anticipated that much experience and that much, really, my cup overflows. So, thank you.
Hello there. I've got to tell you, this whole experience for me, just to share it for a moment, has been more than enlightening. I think one of the most enlightening things about this whole experience is to see his face when the light goes off or goes on. In doing the New Testament, Gadi kind of sat there and, I mean, as deep as he is, he began to see connections, and he began to see how much the New Testament, especially the Gospels, was Jewish history. And unfortunately, we never rehearse. So we end up pretty much clicking almost every time. Because there's as he said, there is a level at which we can all talk. And that level goes beyond dogma and doctrine. All right. As soon as you start talking doctrine and dogma, the defenses go up, and we're very careful. But there is this level of empathy, simpatico, spirituality that has been kind of the binding force of the two of us. I go to his classes on Thursdays. And I sit there and I listened to him talk about the Torah as he looks forward to the following Sabbath. And I'm sitting there like he sits here and catches things. I sit there and all of a sudden I see the reasons for the deep spirituality that we have as Christians. And I understand now where it all comes from. You can't understand Christianity if you can't understand Judaism. All right? You can't understand Christ if you don't understand Christ was a Jew through and through. So it's been a great experience for me too. On a practical level, we're starting with this idea of the prophets. And don't forget, that idea came from you. You were the ones who asked us, after we finished last year, to talk on the prophets. We're going to spend most of the year using Isaiah as a foundation. But we will kind of jump off, as Gadi had said before, making relationships with the other prophets. Now, the prophets we're talking about here especially, and I brought this up last month, are the 8th century prophets. And the 8th century was pretty much the beginning of what we had talked about called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age was that period of history where the great religions, as we know them today, began their formation. All right? And so there was a whole value system that grew out of that bears witness to where we are today. And within the Jewish perspective, what comes out of this axial age are the prophets.
You say 8th century. What do you mean exactly?
Let's keep maybe the question to
all
the
right, but from the 8th century, what I'm talking about here is basically from the 700s BC. Okay? Remember, the prophets were very special individuals. We had said last time, I don't think too many of us would like to run into or have a prophet as a dinner guest. They were pretty harsh characters. Right? They were frightening characters. They made the comfortable uncomfortable. And that's very, very important because most of us see prophets as these people who kind of almost look into a crystal ball and point to the future, especially Christians. You know, well, we have made Isaiah the Christian prophet because there are so many references in Isaiah to Christ. But I don't think in today's day and age we understand what those prophets were all about. And those prophets basically were the foundation for the interpretation of everything that Israel did from that time on. Right? They were the paradigm, if you will, of what Israel was called to be and to do. But at the same time, they had absolutely no patience with sin. They had no well, to refresh your memory, there were 3 basic sins, if you will, that the prophets fought tooth and nail. The first one, and always the first one, would be idolatry. Okay, because they understood that when you worship an idol, you become what you worship. You become what you worship. And if you worship something that can't save you, then you become as impotent as that idol. Okay. And therefore, the focus, total focus, was on the worship of the one God. All right. Secondly, they were fought against what we called religious formalism, and Gadi brought that up. It's not the externals of religion. It's not the externals of worship that we should be concerned about. If you cannot worship without sincerity, as Gadi said, it's useless. I mean, I think of the way people go to church today. Not disturbed at all. They're not upset by the Word of God. And the Word of God should make us shake and quake every once in a while because it challenges us. But we go out of rote. We do the same things, but we really don't listen. What do we bring? And what do we take away? And then the third element is this element of social justice. Okay? Now, I want to let you know, since we're going to use Isaiah kind of as the basis for the full year, I just realized that I'm not going to be able to finish today what I had planned to say, but we've got a few more months and I'll catch up. Okay? But I want to set the stage from a historical point of view. You all have the summary there. And now, what is going on in Israel at this point? In the year 922 BC, at the death of Solomon, Judaism, what we call Judaism today, Israel split into two kingdoms. All right? The 10 kingdoms of the north, which then become known as Israel, and the 2 kingdoms of the south, Judah and Benjamin, that is Judah. So we have Judah as the 2 tribes and Israel as the 10 tribes. So they're going their own way. Israel's capital is Samaria. All right? Judah's capital is Jerusalem. Now what we have to remember is that the great nation at this time was Assyria. That was the all-encompassing enemy of Judah and Israel. So basically we have this history of Judah now, the southern kingdoms, where you have listed on the summary in the front, starting in about 783, King Uzziah is the king of Judah. Excessively proud man. In the sense of he even usurped the power of priesthood. He develops leprosy, he leaves his kingdom to a regent, and meanwhile, Assyria is growing under the leadership of this man named Tiglath-Pileser. All right. Now, after Jotham, we have the king Ahaz. Now, Ahaz is important. He comes into play for Christians because he is the king to whom Isaiah promises that a woman would bear a son and his name would be called Emmanuel. All right, so he's the king. But now that has to fit within the context of basically, and we'll get into this later on, Isaiah was telling this particular king, Ahaz, don't get involved in this political fight that's going on in that neck of the woods. These alliances that were beginning to be built up to fight Assyria. You'll never win. And Ahaz is this arrogant man, and Isaiah is telling him, and Isaiah comes from a noble family. So he has an in with the kings. And he's telling Ahaz, don't get involved here. God will take care of everything. Okay. So, obviously, one thing leads to another. The northern kingdom, Samaria, and this is rather important. In 722, 200 years after the split of the kingdoms, we see Israel destroyed. We see Israel, meaning the 10 tribes, being overcome by Assyria, all right, exiled, destroyed, and we know them in popular language as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Okay. Later on, you have the king Hezekiah, and Hezekiah again tried to reform the temple and all of that, but eventually, and the important date here is 701, Assyria wipes out these alliances that these kingdoms have been trying to get involved in, all right, and he lays siege to Jerusalem in 701. Now remember, the exile for the southern kingdom begins at 587. So this is 150 years before that. But at one point, now again, here's where the arrogance comes in. At one point in the attempt of Assyria to storm Jerusalem, they're defeated. And they're defeated by this miraculous event. It's a plague. And all of a sudden, they disappear. Well, what happens is the southern kingdoms, Judah, they're rejoicing. Their arrogance comes full blast. You see, God will take care of everything. All right? The presumption, the religious presumptions, that God will take care of everything. Even if we screw up. All right. And so we have Isaiah coming on the scene. He begins his mission at about 742. So he experiences the split of these kingdoms. All right, and not the split, but he lives through the destruction of the northern kingdom. And so what we do is we move into now the understanding that both Assyria and the northern kingdom, and especially, well, this came into play in Israel too, both Israel and Judah had reached the enormity of riches. They were very wealthy. And so, in other words, what began to happen, as often happens, the wealthy begin to repress and suppress the poor and live off the poor. So, we have the rise of, in this century, the rise of these 8th century prophets. And the first one actually was Amos, who was a farmer. All right, and he lived in the south, and he was sent to the north, where he ultimately was kicked out because they didn't like what he was saying. All right, Hosea was another prophet who was from the north, but who preached to the north again, and he was unsuccessful. Then Micah shows up, and then finally Isaiah shows up, all within a short period of time, all focused on the same thing, but in different circumstances. All focused on the idea of taking care of the poor. Now, it's very interesting. A lot of people have basically said, they refer to the God, if you will, of the Old Testament as a God of wrath, as opposed to the God of love of the New Testament, which is ridiculous because the God of the Old Testament is Jesus as God. I mean, how could it be a God of wrath if he was Jesus as God? But we do see within the context of the Old Testament things that seem like physical, military punishment, especially during the time of the prophets. Let's remember one thing. What is God really ticked off about? He's ticked off about the lack of compassion for the poor. That's what gets his ire up. And that is the primary reason that God is inflamed. We today would call it a justice that is okay. It's an anger that is okay. Because it is all directed towards the question of justice. And there's, so, to move on, you'll see that down at the bottom of the first front of the summary, we enter into this classical era of classical prophecy. And in that second line it says, the writings were left by individual prophets. They became the standard for interpreting Israel's faith by later Jews and Christians. Now, this gives us an understanding of what the prophets are. Every word does not come from the prophet's mouth. There's a lot of switching traditions within the book of the prophets. All right? For example, Isaiah has 66 chapters in it. The longest prophetical work. The major portion of that is Isaiah 1 to 39, which is what we call Isaiah of Jerusalem. In other words, the individual we know of Isaiah, that's the period of time that he prophesies in. All right? 200 years later, we have the second part of the book of Isaiah. All right? Which Christians call the book of consolation. And then shortly thereafter, there is this third section of the book of Isaiah, which we call third Isaiah. We're going to take a look at first Isaiah. Editors rearrange the words. Not all the words come from the mouths of the prophets. Editors move the words around, whatever fits what's going on. The language talks not just the words of the prophet, but something about the prophet or the traditions of the prophet. So let's mention for a moment here this idea of Isaiah of Jerusalem. Now, the scriptural readings I gave you pertain basically, you've got basically four sides of scriptural references here. They all refer to the themes of Isaiah within the first 39 chapters, the key themes. So I listed the themes in bold print there. And they come up, and I'll point out some of the things which are more important than others. Isaiah was involved in the political life of his day. Okay, we said that he was probably from a noble family. After 701, when Assyria is defeated, Judah becomes more arrogant. It's in your face. God will save us regardless of what we'll do. All right? And that comes out of this idea, well, look what he did. He destroyed Assyria. All right? He'll take care of us. Isaiah's message in this context was that, first of all, and by the way, these under Isaiah's message, these elements are contained in the scriptural readings as they pertain to the themes. So, for example, anger. Isaiah's message contains anger against oppression. He denounces idolatry and abandonment of, I have to be very careful here because the name that we give God, Jews don't pronounce that name. So I will either refer to that name as the Tetragrammaton, which means the four letters, YHWH, okay? But to pronounce that whole name in respect for the Jews, I will try my best. I'll probably slip a couple of times. I will try my best not to pronounce the sacred name of God. Okay? If anybody wants to know what the name is, I'll see you later. Okay.
It can also be Adonai.
Yeah, we can also call him Adonai, which means Lord. Okay. It shows God's sorrow and demand for justice. He concentrates on God's concern for the whole world. Now, again, this is important. We will get into the very famous calling of Isaiah. We won't do that today, but we'll do it next time, because Isaiah's call in chapter 6, all right, pretty much sets out the whole theme of where Isaiah is. Chapter 6 to 11, you pretty well get a capsulized understanding of where Isaiah is in terms of his life. And basically, in this vision, he sees God sitting above the temple, and his vision and so on. We'll get into that. But the whole idea there was that it was God who was covering the whole world. God's influence and holiness. And what Isaiah understands by that first vision is that there is nothing more important than God's holiness. It's where we get the expression, holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Okay? That is what the angels are saying to God. But as Gadi will explain to you, the holiness in Judaism means separation. Holiness is separation, and he'll explain that to you more clearly. And when we say Lord God of hosts, we mean Lord God of armies. So there was still this element of militarism, but it's now being placed in the context of the compassion of God. The other thing you'll have to remember about most of these prophets, you will have both in the prophecy, all right, calls for punishment and destruction and calls for compassion and hope. The Jews are never left hanging without hope. And one of the things that's very interesting to notice that over the whole period of these three sections of Isaiah, okay, I mentioned it down at the bottom of that page. It leads to this whole idea of hope arising out of all of this, which then fosters the idea of a Messiah to come. All right. And therefore, those hopes are raised within the context of Judaism, the later prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and then the Christians, in trying to understand Christ, also take on and try to use the prophetic words to understand who Christ is. Okay? That's the importance of this. But throughout all of this, all right, there's no final judgment that God makes on Israel. No final judgment. There's always a judgment, but then there's always the mercy and compassion that grows out of that. Over and over again. So you can never say that, for example, as we hear today, or understand today, that somehow God has written off the Jews. Right? They have been overcome by this whole idea of love and so on. And yet, the whole history of the covenant is the movement from punishment to hope. And each section is made to point that out. The Jews are never left hanging without some sort of hope. Just as leaving the Garden of Eden, there was the hope of someone to come later. All right? We Christians have basically taken that and said, okay, this is the way we understand Jesus, so we use the prophet, especially of Isaiah. And Matthew will quote Isaiah all over the place. So, as I said, holiness is the overall theme for Isaiah, first Isaiah. So that's kind of the beginning. I've got more to say about Isaiah and his calling. We'll do that the next time around. So that's kind of the background, the beginning. Now Gadi can wake all of you up who have dozed off a little bit. And
I don't know. We'll see.
he's on.
Thank you very much. As we began and saying, and Don, of course, drove this point, that the prophets always talk about social justice, that we're not doing enough for the poor. By the way, just a side thought, I'm thinking, if there's really a committee that wants to do peace in this world, I think it's very good, but we have to prioritize our efforts also as humanity. And right now, there are people who are starving as we speak in Africa, on the streets. A lot of people starving. I would say, let's start by saying that nobody should starve. Something more practical that I think the world is there at least. Let's not make people die of hunger. And the prophets have already been telling this to us thousands of years ago, that it doesn't mean your army, the strength of your army, or the strength of your whatever you're going to surround yourself with, is never going to be enough to sustain a punishment from God. What can sustain you, us, is charity, is giving charity. And actually, in the high holidays, the liturgy of our high holidays, the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is that, especially Yom Kippur, is when you give charity, it can protect you from death. Charity can protect you from death. It's something that we say all the time. And that's what it means. It means that what we just actually yesterday read it in the synagogue, it's if you forget me, God is saying, if you forget me, I'll forget you. And how do you forget God? By pretending that coming to sacrifice with the whole family dressed nicely, but you passed by 100 homeless people and you totally ignored them. I don't know how kosher your sacrifice is. Frankly, it's supposed to be a product of a kosher process. You can't be kosher at the end of the process if your process was not kosher. And that's what the prophets keep telling us. The whole Torah really is, and for many years I've tried to articulate this in one phrase, right? Beyond, of course, what Hillel, the sage, says and the Torah says, love your neighbor, right? Love your neighbor like you love yourself. And then Hillel says, in the Talmud, he says, Don't do unto others what is hated to you. Everything else is commentary. Right? So basically, God, right, through His prophets, is telling us that when you forget the least among you, right, that comes from the New Testament, the least, then you forget God. That's really how your relationship with God, our relationship with God, is through the weakest link. Through the weakest link. Because, and there's a phrase in Hebrew that said, Kol Israel arevim ze lazeh, or ze bazeh. All Israel are responsible for each other. So really, that is the strength of a society, is if everybody is responsible for each other. It's not how many tanks you have. It doesn't mean that you don't need to have tanks and you don't have to do anything and just believe that God will save you. No. Because if you're not ready to defend yourself, why should God defend you? You have to actually do the best you can. That's a sacrifice. That you do the best you can. Because if not, it's like going to the gym and taking the lightest dumbbell, right, and pretend you're working out. You're not. It has to be lift. You have to feel that you're lifting. So it can be monetary sacrifice. It could be emotional sacrifice. It could be not drinking for Lent. That's a sacrifice for people who like alcohol. I mean, to me, it won't mean anything. But for somebody else, sitting here, I can think of a couple of those who laughed the hardest. That, yes, 40 days not to have alcohol, that's a stretch. So, that's what the prophets are telling us. If it's too easy for you, if you're too comfortable, then you're doing something wrong. Right? You have to get uncomfortable. Because we're here for a short amount of time, and there's always work to do. And if you think that you can let China pollute, and it's not going to affect you eventually, you're wrong. Everybody has to be responsible to each other. So Israel is just a case study. That's all I always refer to it. Israel is the case study, is the proof of concept that it can work. And then, of course, it'll be light upon the nations. That people will learn from that and hopefully get the idea. But it's anything that the prophets tell Israel is, they're telling it to the whole world. Make no mistakes, right? And we know it today. It's not about telling a specific group of Jewish people in the village in Galilee. It's about preaching it to the world, right? It's always a Sermon on the Mount. Moses goes to the mountain to receive. It is coming from above. So it's for the whole world, because if there's one God, and this is part of my work in Interfaith, is when there's arguments or conflicts about who God is, what God is, I don't know. If you believe that God is one and there's only one God, that means there's only one God. That means that God that I believe in is your God too. So whatever God is saying, it's, of course, it has eternal truth, and God is everywhere, right? So it's true for everybody. So societies rise and fall, not because they couldn't protect their walls necessarily. It's because they were crumbling from the inside. The temples, the Talmud tells us that the temples in Jerusalem fell because there was crumbling inside. The Jewish facets were not able to agree with each other. So if you don't have that, you can't really have a society. So it doesn't matter what you protect yourself or what lines in the map you're going to draw. That means nothing. One of my conclusions about coming back this time from Israel and Palestine is that, and I wrote about this to the newsletter from Israel, is that we're looking at the solution in a wrong way. We're saying two-state solution. Okay, two-state solution can be a good solution, but it has to result of a process. You can't force something, you can't just force lines on the map if these two people can't live together. And then I realized that they do live together. They live together already for a long time. They're maybe denying that they live together, but now that Patty's here, for 10 days, we were in Israel. There were a couple of days that Bethlehem or Jericho in the Palestinian territories, but basically we were in Israel for 10 days. And the company here, the Christian company 206, hires in Israel a subcontractor, someone to operate the trip on the ground. And the Christians in Israel are Arab, and so they lead those trips. So in a very odd way, I was in Israel, same places I grew up in, same places I hung out with my friends, family. All of a sudden, I'm living in an Arab world. For 10 days, did not hear one Hebrew word, because the guides were Arab, but they spoke English, of course. But besides that, there was no interaction with a Jewish Israeli. Unfortunately, the only interaction was at the checkpoint going to Jericho and to Bethlehem. But other than that, it wasn't political. There was no politics. But it was amazing because they were all Arabs, because it was an Arab company. So the hotels, even a lot of Arabs work at hotels in Israel. So basically, there's a whole nation that lives within a nation, or side by side anyway. That's what I'm trying to say. So the solution is not a two-state solution. It's a two-nation solution. And perhaps this little tiny area may not be able to ever have real fence between the two nations. They may have to kind of share the land, because there are a lot of holy sites that you want each other to come and visit, right? Jews have a lot of holy sites in Judea and Samaria. You can't deny the Jews access, and you don't want to deny access to Muslims who happen to live in Palestine to go to Jaffa or to the beach in Tel Aviv, right? So we're looking at it from the very artificial place. And getting back to the prophets, they're telling us, don't look there. Right? God is holy. Yes, Isaiah gives us this whole event that happens in heaven. Holy, 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 and the host, and which we'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is that don't look up. Look up, but work like you're here, like you're down here. So those poor people, if you're not going to help them and if you're not going to feed them, they're not just going to miraculously have food. There's work to do in this world. So you always have to feel like you're stretching yourself at least a little bit, right? My sermon in the High Holiday was, don't stress yourself, stretch yourself. So yes, if it already is stressful, then yes, don't give all your money. Give 10%. Then if you have more, then give another 10%, but that's it. But always be uncomfortable. Know that there's always people that need your time, your help, your anything. And really, this is the message of the prophets. I do want to talk about, and I'll finish with that, to talk about the Isaiah vision of God with the hosts. So I was going to read to you a couple of verses, but it doesn't matter. I'll just say it. God of hosts in Hebrew is tzvaot. Tzava is army or host, and tzvaot, here it's hosts, but that word tzava is not, and I've heard this interpretation many times, that it's referred to as only in the military aspect. And it's not. It actually is not. And I do believe that in this case, we're not talking about military. We can talk about military, but we can talk about a military of angels, right? Or spirits, not real, because God is eventually the God of peace. God doesn't have, those imaginary soldiers that we think, and the reason I'm saying it is because of one fact. The same word, tzava, is referred to, for going to the military. In the book of Numbers, the people of Israel are numbered. That's why it's called the book of Numbers. And the Levites are counted separately. There's a census, and any male above 20 years old goes to the army. In the Levites, they go to the army of God, meaning they go to serve at the temple. And it also is referred to as tzava. It's the same word. So tzava is not necessarily has a military connotation. It's both. Tzava really means litzbot, means to organize around something. That's litzbot. That's to do an army, which means that it could be to have a set orders and an arrangement, to be organized. That's really the word tzava means. So you can organize around military, or you can organize around the work in the temple, and they're both equally called tzava. And in Israel, for example, if you're a religious person, you don't go to the military, so to speak. You do civil service. Civil service. So, but that civil service is still, in the under the auspices of your military service. So really, it means to organize. So it doesn't really negate the idea that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, the God in the Hebrew Scripture is an angry God because of that. Tzvaot, armies, mean more than that. So, yes, and it's up to us to, of course, to decide in our lives what army do we serve, right? Like Don said, what you worship, the idol that you worship, you become it, right? You become anything you do or eat or see. That is the assumption. And I just want to complete Don's idea about what the three sins that the prophets were always against. Of course, number one is idol worshiping. Because idol worshiping means you're not even in the conversation. You're not even doing part of it. The second is bloodshed. So no killing, no murdering. And the third is incest, forbidden sexual relations. These are, and which a lot of times somehow were related, and even the bloodshed, they were all somehow related to idol worshiping, because there were all kinds of cultish, ceremonies that may have done something with bloodshed, with children, with all kinds of things. So, but these are the three big ones, and the way that the rabbis said, okay, these are the three destructions. We need three positive pillars that will be against them, right? So the three pillars are Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. It's the Torah, meaning the study of Torah, the fulfilling of the Torah, which is negates of course, the idol worshiping, right? Then we have the Avodah. Avodah is the prayer, the sacrifice to God, right? So that if you involved in that, you can be, you're not going to take blood. You're giving life. You're not taking life. So that's the bloodshed. Against the bloodshed is the service to God and helping poor and all that. And the last one is Gemilut Chasadim. Gemilut Chasadim goes against the incest, because Gemilut Chasadim is to be a kind person, to do a good deed, what we call, right? A lot of times, good deeds and mitzvot are interchangeable, but they're not. So good deeds is that you're doing good deeds, that you don't necessarily have to be rewarded. You're not asking to be rewarded for or recognized for. You're giving it because you think it's needed. So giving beyond your taxes to charity, that's Gemilut Chasadim. That's you're doing a chesed. So you're doing it beyond. And the reason that it's against the forbidden sexual interaction is because even on both sides, charity and sexual contact, you can cross the line. It's good, but then you can cross the line. You can say to, an officer in the military can start by, counseling his female soldier, and then can develop to something else. That's bad. That's bad sexual relation. But it can start with anything, with parents, with family. This is what we're trying to stay away from. So these three, against these three, teach us that these are the prophets concentrate on these three pillars. Knowing, not idol worshiping, because that takes you out of the conversation. Then bloodshed, respect the human life, and of course the ethical. Then you build on it. The ethical part to go beyond on both sides, beyond your means or beyond the regular sacrifice. You give extra. That's Gemilut Chasadim, and sexual is to stay away from that. Any extra there. These are the idea of the prophet that we raised today, and that's it. And then we can open it to questions if you have any. Thank you.
Several questions, but I don't want to bore you with all of them, so I'll give you the one that I'm most curious about. In the holy month or whatever it is, the 40 days or whatever, you're talking about making a sacrifice and say not drinking alcohol was your example.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, does the sacrifice have to benefit somebody? You were talking about helping the poor and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my question is, does the sacrifice have to lead us to giving to the poor, or is it just a personal thing having nothing to do with the
very
poor?
good, very good. I'll start and you can answer. That's an excellent question. The prophets are asking you to give authentic sacrifice, because that's really what they're asking, authentic sacrifice, because they want it to just for you to work on yourself, or they want it to result in something. So, of course, I would say they want to result of something. So there's a whole discussion in the Talmud about the benefit of, if there's a question, should a person study Torah or fulfill mitzvot? What is more important? What is the? So I'm gonna pose the question to you. So learning, you have an hour a week. Let's say, are you going to study Torah, or are you going to volunteer in a hospital of that hour that you have? So what do you think is more important? No, I know, but that's where the difficulty is I'm pushing it. I'm saying you only have an hour. You can do either or. Of course, both is definitely.
Third option.
What's the third option?
Nothing.
Right, we're leaving that out. Yes, so what is more important, do you think? The what? You can't. You can't do half hour of each. I know, that's the ultimate, but you can't. It's one or the other. So Mary was the one that studied.
Right.
And then Martha was serving. Right. So actually, in the discussion, the conclusion is it's better to learn. It's better to study. But why? Because studying will lead you to doing. Right? And that really is very important. So you first, but it means one more thing. It means that if you don't first learn, how are you going to help somebody else? Right? So it's the same process of repentance, essentially. This is what it is when you do tshuva. So on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, one time a year, one person, one place. But before he can do that, before he can go and speak to God directly, basically, right? That was like a local call to God. Right? There's a phone there, there's a red phone, and it's a local call to God. But before he can do that, and we read also last night in the book of Esther, Esther couldn't just approach Ahasuerus, the king of Ahasuerus. She had to go through bathing and cleaning and, right, before she can see the face of God, of the king, right? So same thing with us. The point is eventually to be able to see God, right, and to be able to be in the presence of God, right? But in order to do that, you have to prepare. So the high priest, for example, on Yom Kippur, before he goes and sacrifices for the people, he first sacrificed for himself. It's three parts. First for himself, he has to first redeem himself, then his family, the closest circle, and then the people, the nation. If you have not cleaned yourself, you can't be any good for others. And that is the concept. So love thy neighbor, right, like you love yourself. You first have to love yourself. You first have to resolve things with yourself before you can help somebody else. Because you can help also people and not do it well and hurting them. So you also always start with yourself, but the goal is eventually for you to be able, for your outcome, to be able to help others. So whether it be poor or, psychological issues or any issue that could be peace, all that. So it started with us, but yes, the point is to get to the society, back to the society.
And I would just add to that, since Christians are in the midst of Lent, and we're asked to do penance. Now, penance basically means, it doesn't mean being sorry. It means turning yourself around. All right? It comes from that whole idea of conversion. All right? So, what I would say is, in terms of Lent as being a special penitential season, I'll put it in terms of its end. If you are not more other-centered on Easter Sunday than you were on Ash Wednesday, Lent is just an exercise in futility. In other words, you ultimately, by turning around, you have to become more and more other-centered. That is the whole purpose of doing penance. All right? And in other words, if you want to put it in the context of Lent and the Easter season, the ultimate turning around and being other-centered is on the cross. All right? If you want to use the image of the outstretched arms of Christ, all right? The other-centeredness that is pointed there. But we have to go through our own lens of our own turning around, of our own, use the word sacrifice, forgetting oneself. Don't forget the word sacrifice means to make holy. All right? So if we do sacrifice, we are becoming more and more holy. But for us, holiness points outward. Okay? It's just like love between two people. Love is useless unless it's generative. whether that ends up as generating a child or generating other-centeredness towards other people. So again, to answer your question, it has to be ultimately outward going, other-centered,
Yeah.
God-centered. All right, that's the purpose of doing.
I think it's worth actually repeating a concept that we've talked about here before. But every mitzvah in the Torah talks about basically finding your boundaries, setting boundaries to everything you do in life. To set boundaries. Mitzvah is really to set boundaries. So for example, Shabbat, right? There's a boundary there. You, at sunset, on Friday, it's the Sabbath, whether you want it or not. Whether you keep it or not, it's the Sabbath. And then until sundown, or stars, when you see stars on Saturday night. So if it's an exercise of putting a limit. Okay, I cannot cook anymore from that minute. I have to put my cell phone down. I can't do certain things. And all the mitzvot are like that. There's an element of that. And the point is that you first have to be holy yourself, separate, right? You have to put yourself in boundaries. When next time your neighbor tells you, please don't eat from my tree of knowledge, whether it's God or your neighbor and anybody, you will respect their boundaries. It's not about you, it's about what they're asking. So, but we can never reach peace or justice if people can't know how to limit themselves and know when to intervene, when not to intervene. Sometimes it's better not to intervene, right? If you intervene, you just cause a lot more damage. And the prophets taught us that there's no peace without justice. That's why we have to pursue justice, because we want to arrive peace at the end. But there's no peace without justice, and justice is a just distribution of resources. Remember this. This is the whole Torah. It's just distribution of resources. It could be spiritual resources, it could be physical resources, it could be all kinds of, it could be land, but it is how do you practice in this classroom, God is telling us, before you move on. I want to see, so your setting it doesn't matter what setting you have. It's all the same rules. Are you going to, even if you have $1 on earth, can you give 10 cents to feed somebody who has less than you? There's always going to be people who have more and people who have less, and you don't know this math. All you have to do is practice the rules of curbing yourself so you can respect each other's space and be everybody's holiness.
Yeah, the Pope had a very interesting statement the other day. He was talking about giving alms, and basically his point is, if you believe someone is in need, you give to that person, and don't worry about what he's going to do with the dollar. I mean, so many people, well, if I give him the dollar, he's going to go drink it away. That's his choice. You know, we're not asked to make their choices. And I think Gadi is saying the same thing. You know, we see poverty, we see suffering. We make a choice to do something. That's what we're held accountable for. We're not held accountable for what that other person does with that money or whatever it is. So I think that's, you know, kind of
The Jewish jury is out on that. It's not that clear. Because actually, if you can prove that person is actually using it for bad, to make it worse, then actually
you're talking about splitting hairs.
That's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for. Good Jewish tradition.
All right, thank you very much, and hopefully
now,
we have a.
Before we go, we do not have a date yet for April. All right, we ran into a conflict this week, so we'll be notifying you about what we're going to do. But got notified from Dominic this week that our date in April was swallowed up, and Gadi is occupying on another day. So we'll let you know.
Okay, great.
Right?
Thank you very much. Thank you.